To the Constitution, the legislature could not vote itself a pay raise during their current term in office. Today, pay raises are recommended by a special commission and have to be approved by the voters at the next election. Historically, the voters never approve such salary increases. A person may not serve in the legislature at the same time as serving in some other office. For example, you could not be a state senator and a U.S. congressman at the same time. There were a few exceptions. You could be a notary public or on a school board while serving in the legislature. A representative or senator during the legislative session cannot be arrested except on a charge of treason or a felony like robbing a bank or something, or breach of the peace, which might include starting a brawl in a bar. But for minor charges, they have immunity. I remember in the 1970s, a state legislator during the session was pulled over for drunk driving. This was on Central Avenue in Phoenix. In a slurred voice, I imagine, she protested to the police officer, "You can't arrest me, I have legislative immunity." And she was absolutely correct. They did not arrest her. What the cops unofficially did do, however, was to make sure that the incident was reported in all the newspapers. And of course, she was defeated at the next election. As I think we've noted already, the Arizona Constitution, even the original version of 100 years ago, is significantly longer than the U.S. Constitution. And the main reason is that states tend to go into great detail about creation of departments, rules, regulations, etc. So we'll wrap this up with a quick run-through, in no particular order, of some other pieces of our original Constitution. And remember that many things were required by the Enabling Act. For example, we had to create a public school system. It could have no ties to organized religion, and classes had to be taught in English. We had to create a system of courts. The expenses of the Supreme Court were paid by the state. Superior courts were funded half by the state and half by the county. Justice of the peace courts were set up. The Court of Appeals did not come along until many, many years later. But something else we did that seems progressive for that time was to establish special judicial rules for handling juveniles. The Constitution, of course, authorized the taxing authority, and they felt compelled to note in the Constitution that taxes had to be paid with money, no chickens or goats. And speaking of tax revenues, there's a provision that the budget indebtedness of the state government shall never exceed $350,000. Yeah, right. They established the Arizona Corporation Commission, which not only certified corporate entities, but also was given the authority to regulate electrical power, the movement of gasoline, natural gas, oil, trains, buses, as well as to regulate telegraph and telephones. There's a provision for a state mine inspector to be elected by the people, which he still is. There was also the election of a state auditor, but those duties now rest with an appointed auditor general. Various sections addressed working people. The 8-hour workday was adopted, but it was only mandatory in the case of government employees. The legislature was directed to enact a workman's compulsory compensation law, now called workers' comp, to help cover expenses of people hurt on the job. Children under age 14 could not be employed during the hours that school was in session. And here's a final one to think about. No child under 16 years of age could be employed in an underground mine. I guess that was considered pretty progressive at the time. Well, keep in mind that all the topics we've covered relate to the original Arizona Constitution, written in 1910 and adopted in 1912. It has been amended about 100 times over the past 100 years. If you've watched this entire documentary series so far, you have dedicated about 4 hours on the history of the U.S. and the Arizona Constitutions. And there's another 2-hour production examining the most historically or constitutionally significant U.S. and Arizona court cases. Now, we've talked at length about why our ancestors, the colonists, decided to break away from England and create the United States of America. But in closing, let's talk briefly about Arizona. I think the big question is, why did people come here at all? The central and southern parts of the state were hot and desolate. In early times, there were warring Indian tribes to contend with. Water was at a premium. Transportation was difficult at best. And of course, there would be no real air conditioning until the 1950s, and for most people, the 1960s. So why did people come? I phoned a number of friends whose families have been here anywhere from 85 years to 135 years and asked them that question. One fellow said his great-great-grandfather had killed a man in Oregon and figured the law wouldn't come looking for him down here in the desert. That family became very prominent ranchers. 3 friends mentioned tuberculosis and asthma, so we can credit some population growth to the advice of early Eastern physicians. There came hard rock miners who were often Slavic people. There were lumber mill workers up north who were sometimes African Americans. There were cattle people and cotton people, often in from Texas. There were the folks who came and started the citrus industry. In territorial days, there was something called the California Backwash. These were folks who had gone to California looking for gold. When they didn't find any, they sort of wandered back toward Arizona and went to work or started a business. Barry Goldwater told me that was part of how his family got here. What did all these people have in common? Well, often they were getting away from something, if nothing more than the locked-in social and political structures that they came to know back where they were from. But far more important, they were looking for something, and that something was opportunity. Our old friend, historian Don Dodera, summed it up best. He said, Arizona was the land of the second chance. There's a lot of truth to that. And our friend Balladeer Dolan Ellis, in one of my earlier shows, said this.
The giant saguaro cactus is capable of going a year and a half without any additional moisture at all. And all of our plants and our animals have learned to do that. And I think that relates to the people who live in Arizona, too. I think an Arizonan is a survivor. Arizona is a person who wasn't quite satisfied where he was living someplace else, and he had the courage to uproot himself and his family, head out to a new city, and be able to cut out a new life for himself. Certain grittiness.
And there was a common pattern to this Arizona migration, a practice that dates back certainly to the earliest days of Ellis Island, and possibly to the colonial period. The dad would come first, alone, find work, find a home, save every dollar he could, then send for the wife, kids, and perhaps other family members. That was certainly my family's story coming to Arizona in 1951, when the state had a few 100,000 people, but more coming every day. Today it's around 6 million. It's been interesting and an honor, really, for me to have grown up here, watched us grow, and to share with you her history and that of our nation. And so we leave you with a final story. In 1866, our second territorial governor, Richard McCormick, brought his 23-year-old bride, Margaret, from her genteel New Jersey home to be Arizona's First Lady. She was the first First Lady to actually live in Arizona. It was planned that Richard and an entourage would tour the territory, visiting every wide spot in the road that had any population at all. They were few and far between, so it required him to travel from Prescott to Tucson to Yuma and back. And the only way to accomplish this was on horseback. Well, of course, Margaret would not be subjected to this torturous journey. Of course, Margaret would, insisted Margaret. How better to give these rugged Arizona pioneers confidence in the future, to let them know that civilization and government had arrived, that we were now officially part of America the Beautiful. How better than for a slip of a girl from New Jersey to meet the challenge. And so she went, bouncing along in the saddle, week after week, 500, 600, 700 miles. And the people extended their welcome and expressed their delight at the discovery that the First Lady was several months pregnant. During the final leg of that horseback tour, Margaret began to experience complications with her pregnancy. They made it back to Prescott, to the so-called Governor's Mansion, a log cabin which stands today at the Charlotte Hall Museum. And there, on April 30, 1867, gave birth to a baby girl who died, as did Margaret McCormick. Again, she was the first of our First Ladies to actually live in the territory, but more deserving of our gratitude, she was that First Lady who gave her life, demonstrating her belief in the future of a rugged place called Arizona. I'm Bill McCune. Take care.